We got our last speaker. I want to really welcome David. So
Mhm.
Dr. David Waldron, he is an associate professor at the Federation University in Melbourne, Victoria. Dr. David Waldron specializes in folklore and community heritage. He is the author of Sign of the Witch, um, Modernity and the Pagan Revival, Shock, the Black Dog of Bungay, a case study in local folklore, and Snarls from the Tea Tree, Victoria's Big Cat Folklore. He also edited and contributed to Goldfields and the Gothic, a hidden heritage and folklore, and authored Aradale, the making of a haunted asylum. Interesting. And he will be talking about the Almanac of a Cunning Man.
Mm.
Sounds really curious and interesting. Thank you, David, so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Joyce. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. If someone's not, I'm coming through. Great. Awesome. So what I thought I might talk about today is talking about folklore, folk beliefs, practices and superstitions on the Goldfields that were the particular, and this is where we're sort of going to end up in this talk, um, a particular collection of folk remedies, cures and curses and spells and things held by a cunning man who practiced in Tasmania in the 1840s. So to sort of give a bit of a start with this, I'm going to talk a little bit about witchcraft beliefs in Australia. And it's not something we normally talk about. It's something that to a large extent, even in the era, was suppressed compared to similar situations in the UK where it got tied to national identity and heritage. Now, the period of the 19th century, particularly the early 19th century, is a period of transition. And it's one where the older folk beliefs in magic and so on were gradually being replaced through mass education and so on with a systemic enlightenment-based education. Nonetheless, this is a period which does see a number of witch trials, witch lynchings and so on, quite well documented in the United Kingdom, but I also found some in Australia, particularly in the early gold rush era of the early 1850s. So one, for instance, I'll start with here, is the story of Gottfried Hoffmann, who feloniously assaulted, as they say, cutting, maiming and otherwise assaulting Mary Ann Wressell. So Mary Ann Wressell was a young woman in her early 20s who had a child, small child. He'd been loaning her butter and other items after her husband had passed on. And at a certain point, he decided against this, and he claimed as a result that she had used magic to curse his stock, and they were becoming ill. And he came across the notion, and this is drawing on old European folklore beliefs, that only through using her blood could he wash his hands and then cure and resolve the magical assault. So he assaulted her with a knife, took her blood, washed his hands in her blood, saying that now mine cows are right. And poor Mary Ann Wressell was quite seriously injured. He was sent to court and was sent to prison for 5 years. And it was something that caused quite enormous anxiety here in 1853, because there was, if you think about the early gold rush period, people were coming here from all over the world to colonial Australia, and they were bringing their folklore with them. And there was a concern that these supernatural beliefs would be brought in large numbers, leading to chaos and the kinds of atrocities we saw in the British witch trials. This fellow here, Gottfried Hoffmann, was a man of only 28 years of age, sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for a crime founded in ignorance, as they presented it. And as I say here, as the matters stand at present, there's too much reason to fear that in the scattered country districts, the children are growing up in the most profound ignorance, both the quantity and quality of the education being miserably deficient. And it's a dangerous game to play to liberalise political institutions while the education of the people isn't sufficiently cared for. So we're getting this sort of interesting little example here of an early witchcraft panic in 1853 in colonial Australia, in this case, near Adelaide. In fact, we have here Gottfried Hoffmann. You can see his prison record there, and I'll bring it up a bit more closely for stabbing, wounding, and otherwise injuring Mary Ann Wressell. Now, something I found really interesting in this case was that after a year's sentence, Gottfried Hoffmann was pardoned after a petition was signed by his church, arguing that besides this one example of ignorance and superstition, he was otherwise a good church-going man, and so he was freed after a year, which I'm sure was scant comfort for poor Mary Ann Russell, who had a neighbour come back who'd assaulted her with a knife. But when we start getting into the records, digging into trove and court findings, we start to find a number of these cases. We have the case here of a woman who was murdered over supposedly using witchcraft to lure a man away from his wife in Taradale. In fact, we find a number of these sorts of examples, women being hired to poison and curse people, supposedly. And what it, I think, shows is the pervasiveness and richness of these supernatural beliefs. One of the things you can see as a legacy of this is use of what they call so-called witches' marks in old Goldfields era properties. And I was fortunate enough to go out on a archaeological survey of Western Victoria in 2019 to find examples of these. And this is actually one from Glenormiston College near Geelong in Victoria. And you can see the spectacle marks warding off the evil eye, and you can see the marigold carved here next to it in the walls of the stable. And we found quite a number of these. And this is another one here at Glenormiston. Again, you can see the hexafoil carved into the wall. We tended to find these in places like stables, servant quarters, places where essentially you have the poor. You have concentric circles in Glenormiston, which again, if you look at the Old English folklore, was meant to represent the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but was again a symbol of magical protection. Here's another one as well in Smeaton at Anderson's Mill. This is on the second floor window facing out across, and you can see it's been painted over. But this was carved in the second floor window in the stone and overlooks the main courtyard there. In fact, you can see it here. I'm not sure how much it comes through in your screens, but there's the hexafoil carved into the wall here, and then there's concentric circles carved above it. And you can see its position. So there are things that tend to be found on where you enter and exit a building, doorways, fireplaces, windowsills. Now in Britain, these are quite common. If anyone goes to an old British church, you'll find quite a lot of these sort of carved into the wall, various places. In Australia, they're comparatively rarer, but nonetheless, they still appear. Likewise, the burn marks you find on the central pillars of stables, which in, again, the old folklore was tied to the belief you could inoculate these buildings against fire. So it's where you've held a candle up, you've dug it out, and you've burnt a teardrop-shaped mark into the central pillars. Likewise, at the Buanga Cobb and Co, again on the central pillars, you have these marks, in one case marked with the salts here. Another one you'll find from this sort of era is birth calls, which is the amniotic sac taken from a child that's been born with that sac intact. And these were quite highly prized in the gold rush era of Australia. It was believed to protect against drowning, but also provide magical protection. In this case, a birth call was kept inside a small purse that actually belonged to a colleague of mine. It was his great-grandmother's. And indeed, you can see some discussions here, but if you look at the bottom right, for example, you have birth calls for sale here in Druin. And if you go through the old classifieds, you'll find quite a number of these, and also complaints about unscrupulous individuals who are presenting, for example, the birth call of a calf as if it's a human. And again, discussions of this are quite prolific in the papers, but again, it's not something we tend to discuss or work with so much in the present. You get some as well, like this is actually contemporary, quite obviously, but this was a former New Age bookstore on Erard Street in Ballarat, and they've actually carved these marks under the floorboards, which caused the hairdresser who lived there now, sorry, the hairdresser who occupied that premises now, quite a start when they lifted the carpet. You can also find this concealed coffin in Ballarat under what's now the Ballarat Steakhouse. this was actually not Masonic, but it belonged to the League of Oddfellows. And like the Freemasons, they also use the symbolism of a coffin for the third degree. So I'm just going to give a bit of a general overview of these sorts of things you'll find in old houses and properties. Another one example is the use of the nickname for them is foundation sacrifices. You'll find under hearthstones in fireplaces. And this pot, which has a nativity scene on it, was also filled with old pins and may have been, and I'll use that word may, have been a witch bottle, which was a protection designed to help women deal with the pain of childbirth, but also in other folklore to be used to inflict pain and suffering on a witch who cursed you. Again, both cases found under a fireplace at, was it 118 Aradale Street South in Ballarat. You might also come across poppets and dolls hidden in the walls of properties. Again, tied to sympathetic magic folklore in old homes. This particular example, as I'm sort of leading into the story of this almanac, I found this quite a fascinating story. It's a hand of glory that was found in a home at, it was 40 Batman Avenue, Fitzroy in North Melbourne. It belonged to a lady by the name of Margaret Connor. Now, Margaret Connor, when she passed, she died in poverty with just herself and an adopted young girl living with her. She died in poverty, but when servants went and searched the place after she passed, they found £500 hidden in the walls of the property. So the servants then became obviously very thorough searching, and it's an interesting story, someone dying in poverty with a fortune in the walls. In the fireplace behind a brick, they found a skinned, stuffed and preserved human hand and several pieces of human flesh that had been preserved. And this was called the Fitzroy Hand of Glory. If you look into the papers, you can find this. As I say, a savings book was found, shows the real name of the woman was Foran. So we looked up this lady. A police officer described her as, and I quote, the most superstitious woman I've ever had the misfortune to meet, when she passed in 1875. She'd been practicing as a fortune teller the past 5 years since her husband had passed. And as I say, hid these items in the walls of a property. Now, I'm going to have a photo that's a little bit grim in a moment. I'm just giving you warning ahead of time. This is of a body in a gibbet in Bathurst in 1836. That'd be the next slide, actually. Now, when we started looking at the folklore and mythology around a hangman's hand, the hand of glory, so to speak, I actually found this was quite prolific, along with the belief that a hangman's hand could cure someone of almost all ailments. And we actually found multiple cases of a person who'd been executed in colonial Australia, and particularly elderly women had approached people to see if they could have their hand to use to help cure their ailments. As you can see, these examples here with McQueenie's execution. So on the left here, we have a body of a man who was gibbeted in Bathurst in 1836. The photo was taken in 1870. What we found with Margaret Connor was that she had taken the hand from a body that had been gibbeted at Port Arthur when she was a convict, and she'd taken it with her to Melbourne when she left with her husband for the gold rush. Incidentally, this body here, the governor saw this in 1870 and was absolutely horrified and demanded to be reburied. But through this, we have the photograph of this body. So in the colonial Australia until 1836, 1837, in most of the states, people who committed particularly heinous crimes would be hung and their bodies placed in a gibbet at the site of the crime as a warning for other people who might commit similar crimes. On the right here, we have an example of a hand of glory from Whitby Museum in the United Kingdom, which gives us an idea of what it might be like, given as well they describe the hand as being well preserved with a leathery vinegar and formaldehyde solution. This very much seems like a similar description as to the one Margaret Foran or Margaret O'Connor had in her property. So what do we know about Margaret Connor and some of these people? She was born into poverty from Irish immigrants to Manchester. She was illiterate. I'm just going to move this so I can read my writing. Oh, the wrong thing. Sorry a second, I just cancelled my own sharing. She turned to theft. She stole from an employer in Manchester to support her family, was caught and sentenced, sent to Van Diemen's Land for 14 years sentence and transported with her young son. I found the records of her having accumulated 31 penal offences in Tasmania. She lived quite a harsh and criminal existence there in poverty. In the 1850s, she moved to Fitzroy, changed her name to Margaret Foran and then to Margaret Connor. In 1870, her husband James died and she turned to fortune telling to support herself. And this is actually where I found most of these people turned to fortune telling. Their husband died and they started delivering the kinds of folklore remedies and practices they'd been brought up with to people from their ethnic communities. As I mentioned before, a police officer described her as the most superstitious woman I've ever had the misfortune to meet. And we have here her convict record of transportation. The fellow we're going to talk about today in a bit more depth, had a similar story. Mary Barrell practiced in Ballarat. She was a former convict from Scotland. She earned a living telling fortunes after she was abandoned by her husband, or perhaps her husband died, I'm not clear, but he disappeared. She offered comfort and advice to women from her home in Lexington Street. It's on the corner of Ballarat Old Cemetery. Looking at her criminal record in Ballarat, she's mainly being charged with letting her goats run around on the street. However, she was accused by a neighbour, John Ryan, of pretending to cure diseases and foretelling death. And this sort of cemented her reputation as Ballarat's cunning woman. We've got some records of her treatments. One included, for instance, taking back pain by marking someone's back with a nail and hammering it into the ground. And when someone took that nail out, they'd be inflicted with that back pain. Likewise, writing curses and charms on lead taken from a church roof. Now, Ryan actually harassed Barrell for years, threatening and assaulting her. In fact, he attempted to murder her at one occasion, leading Ryan to be imprisoned for a number of years. However, it's worth noting she continued practicing until 1896, and when she died, there was a procession of servant girls took her to a resting place in the Ballarat Old Cemetery. I found it really fascinating. Spiritualist James Curtis and Ballarat pillar of the community, James Oddie, had a large number of conflicts in the newspapers about whether Mary Barrell should still be able to receive a pension or whether she'd be put in the benevolent asylum due to her receiving money for charms and so on. It was said she'd charge up to $1 for her services, so she did reasonably well for what she was practicing. She practiced curses, she practiced charms, she practiced folk healing. There's also a particular context to this as well, where she did a lot of work with regards to childbirth and poor women in Ballarat. Now, it's worth noting James Curtis paid for her to have a plot and a monument when she passed on, yet 2 years later that was desecrated and the monument was destroyed. And right now, if you go to the Ballarat Old Cemetery, there's just a bare patch of earth between two other graves for where she's buried with her son. So here's some examples of Mary Barrell's history, some descriptions of her, and of course discussions here regarding her fortune telling and magical practices in colonial Ballarat between about 1854 to 1896. Louisa Rook is another one a little bit later. Now, her particular speciality was dealing with childcare related issues, including, trigger warning here, but abortions for young women. She'd apparently been practicing since the late 1860s in Ballarat. What fascinates me is she had considerable skills. Where did she learn these skills from? When you read the trial record of Louisa Rook, what you find was there was a network of women who you could follow to lead you to Louisa Rook for her skills, and Louisa Rook herself was part of a network of women who would trade in skills and practices. She particularly practiced herbal medicine, but also had some surgical tools, including one made out of a heavily decorated piece of whalebone akin to a large skewer. A particular incident in 1904 led to a young girl dying where she was brought in with child. The mother was hoping to cover this to avoid family disgrace. It's quite tragic when you read it. It talks about the young child staring at this potion from 10 in the morning to midnight before she was willing to drink it. There was complications and she passed on, and Louisa Rook was charged with her murder. She was sentenced to be executed in the Ballarat jail, but was instead sentenced to 16 years jail. It was commuted. You can actually see her there before and after her experience in prison for 16 years. So what can we say about some of these people before we get to talking about Ben Noakes? There's diverse practices. Cunning folk in 19th century Britain were known for the wide array of magical and healing practices. We find the same here in colonial Australia. We see a mixture of herbal medicine, but also the uses of curses, charms, and prayers to supplement this. Almost all of these, in fact, I'd go as far as to say, all of these people also practice fortune telling through a variety of mediums, ranging from entrails to tea leaves to dice and cards. They were claimed to cure ailments and diseases using traditional and supernatural methods. We found quite often sleight of hand was used as a practice. In one particular case, people were giving them coins that were to be thrown into a well, and they found that at some point in the process they had switched the coins for buttons that were thrown in the well, and presumably the healer had kept the coins for themselves. They played a significant role in their local communities, particularly serving as healers, but also spiritual and personal advisors. And one of the things you find with James Ryan that got him particularly incensed was passing on messages to women about what their husbands were getting up to via other women that they were involved with of, let's say, ill repute. We also found these people are accused of or feared for manipulating supernatural forces, which in some cases led to, in colonial Australia, attempted lynchings and beatings. So this almanac, this was from Tasmania. It's a nondescript little notebook that was hidden in the state archives. And it's opened a window onto some extraordinary lives and yielded some interesting insights into the popular beliefs and practices of traditional medicine in colonial Tasmania. And to a large extent, besides the fragments you get in the newspapers, it's probably the best source that we have as to what people are actually practicing. Pardon me. William Allison, a publican, Benjamin Noakes also later became a publican, were cunning men. They used herbal remedies, lacking formal qualifications, but were widely respected, sort of operating on the boundaries of magic and science. I've got a link there to where you can actually see the digitised archive yourself if you're of a mind. Here's the actual book itself, the Almanac. Now, just bringing up as well, of course, I found this bemusing. A bit of Australian colonial folklore. I found that the almanac had actually been appropriated to be used in Call of Cthulhu, which just amused me a little bit within Australian context. So Benjamin Noakes, what do we know about him? Like many of these other people we discussed, he was convicted of burglary, petty crimes in 1809, sentenced to transportation for life, arrived in Van Diemen's Land 1812, sent to Port Arthur. After he was released, he co-founded Methodism in Van Diemen's Land, but later left after conflicts with the First Minister. He ran a shop in Hobart that sold goods, including his own patent-made insect repellents, and received a 200-acre land grant in 1823. He managed the Albemarle Arms Inn, facing multiple prosecutions during that time. His wife died 5 years later, which affected his ability to maintain the business. Now, perhaps in some ways unique for Benjamin Noakes, he actually advertised his services in the newspapers. So he advertised going there to get curses, to get charms, to get cures, and to buy various treatments for ailments and so on. He died in 1843 in Hobart. He's officially recorded as a doctor due to his reputation as a healer, but he had no medical qualifications whatsoever. In fact, here's his convict record. So here's some examples of some of the advertisements he put in the papers in Tasmania. Fly water as an infallible destroyer of those troublesome insects. Benjamin Noakes begs leave respectfully to recommend his celebrated composition sold at his residence in Collins Street at 3 shillings per quart with printed labels and directions on each bottle. Here we go, another one. It's really astonishing, but nevertheless a fact that Benjamin Noakes, now at Baghdad, has for a number of years past succeeded in curing the most obstinate cases of the gravel, kidney stones, which has failed under the most able practitioners. Several of the patients are known to us and we can vouch for the accuracy of their statement. One of the persons he's cured was afflicted with the gravel for 40 years and declares that since the removal of the disease, he's never enjoyed better health. And so on. So let's have a little bit of a look at what this almanac is that he recorded in, because this also provides part of that folkloric and magical context. So the almanacs were books, and this particular one, The Voice of the Stars, provided long-range forecasts to guide farmers in planting and harvesting cycles. The books contain suggestions on planting, harvesting, and animal husbandry based on old folkloric traditions and astrological associations. Based predominantly on astrology, they gave ideal times to plant different crops, often tied to moon phases, seasonal patterns. They gave data about moon phases, eclipses, sunrises, and sunset times, tips for growing crops, managing pests, old-fashioned sayings, remedies, traditional knowledge. The first edition, 1697, was particularly about weather forecasts. 1700 more produced Vox Stellarum. This contained astrological associations called Old Moore's Almanac, which is where this material has been written. And this was a bestseller through the 18th and 19th centuries, selling as many as 107,000 copies for an edition in 1768. So it's quite a popular repository of traditional knowledge and wisdom. And what we had here is William Allison recording Benjamin Noakes's treatments via his public house in the margins and notes of this book. So what I've done here for this talk is I've gone through and I've written down some of these recipes and traditions. I've just gone through and transcribed them all from the cursive script. And we can have a bit of a look at the certain treatments they were using. So for instance, this one, I've left the spelling mistakes in as written, and you can see it in its original form. So gum guaiacum, niter stones, which is a mineral form of potassium nitrate, brimstone, turkey, rhubarb. He's written in brackets, will it affect a cure, ? In a tablespoon of peach. This medicine is a gentle physician, and you may add a diminish of rose accordingly. It should operate twice. Now, gum guaiacum was believed to reduce inflammation. Brimstone sulfur was considered a purifying agent. Turkey rhubarb was a purgative, which would have been to encourage bowel movements, which was thought to help cleanse the body. I've had some discussions with contemporary doctors about this. They could see it having an impact positively, yet at the same time could potentially cause dehydration and gastrointestinal distress if it wasn't managed particularly well. This one, a certain sacred charm. Whoops, sorry, pardon me, previous. When our Saviour Jesus Christ went to the cross to be crucified, he thanked the Jews who asked him, saying, art thou afraid? He answered and said, I'm not afraid, neither law, and whosoever keepeth this word written or in command shall never be fouled with the ague or fever. Good Lord, deliver us thy persons who suffered their first in heaven, so be it. And I found this particularly interesting. When I've been looking at these people historically, invariably they framed what they did within a Christian context. And, for instance, you have like the concentric circles. It's framed as Father, Son, Holy Spirit as protective circles. So it's represented in those terms by the people at the time. And we do get examples like this, the treatment for ague fever. Another one I came across was writing the Lord's Prayer on your forehead as a cure for headaches. Rheumatic pain was another one. 2 ounces of saltpeter, a laurel of vinegar, boil them, let it stand simmering, strain it, put in a bottle to use, tub the part with by the fire just when going to bed. For loss of work, horseradish, board of colours for handsome sections of horseradish, cut short dried chunks in the mouth, approved by Ben Noakes. Now, it's interesting too here because horseradish has stimulant properties and was used traditionally to relieve respiratory congestion. So it could, in a sense here, help to clear sinuses, invigorate the body temporarily. It does reflect a propensity in these treatments to look at symptomology rather than causes as we think of them today in contemporary medicine. Likewise, the saltpeter would create a warming solution that could have provided pain relief through external application, particularly when rubbed by the fire. And I've heard it argued that this would give an effect not dissimilar to deep heat in treating the pain from these ailments. Another one, burn from a scald, a tablespoon of flicked lime, finely sifted, put in half a pint of linseed oil, spread on cloth and put on the part. Now, this would have acted as a soothing but also potentially hazardous treatment because, of course, lime is caustic. And it could have worsened burns. And again, a lot of this would depend on how well it was applied, what quantities they used, and how well they used it. But that being said, the lime could increase risk of chemical burns on the areas, again, given by Ben Noakes. For consumption, spoonful of honey, an ounce of oatmeal, a piece of butter the size of a walnut, and the yolk of an egg. Upon this, pour 1 English pint of boiling water to be poured out slowly, together taken when going to bed. On each, place half an ounce of finely powdered, mixed together. Take a teaspoon of the above powder every other night. Now, just bringing up my notes on this particular one for consumption. Yeah, all right. The gravel for kidney stones. Now, my understanding for this, using parsley, 2 handfuls washed, scrape them like horseradish, add a handful of pennyroyal, boil them in a gallon of water for half an hour, strain them when cold and bottle. Now, I understand this would help you pass kidney stones, but I've also heard it said no one's going to thank you for helping pass kidney stones. Would have been excruciatingly painful, but nonetheless would have been potentially able to affect a cure depending on the sizes of the stones. This is, of course, his patented treatment for gravel that he was advertising in the papers. Inward piles, a good handful of marshmallow, pick and wash them, boil them well, strain them, drink a teacup when going to bed. Now, I'll just bring up here. So, marshmallow root could help soothe inflammation. Drinking the marshmallow tea, I've been told, will help soothe the symptoms of internal hemorrhoids, which would provide comfort by reducing inflammation. Likewise, for outward piles, taking hog's lard stubbed between 2 pieces of lead from a church roof till it is an ointment. Scrub on the parts. Now, I'm told the lard would help soothe the immediate pain of piles, but on the other hand, there's some interesting questions about the use of lead, even if it comes from a church roof, and of course has the folkloric associations of the lead from a church roof for helping to relieve against supernatural ailments. This one, I'm told, would have been extremely dangerous. You could cover the gangrene, but it almost certainly would cause the gangrene to fester underneath and be quite lethal. That being said, if you're getting gangrene in the 1840s, I'm not sure what's going to be done to help you. We came across a recipe for perennial allergies. Calamine, hallob mixed into 30 pills, 1 at night, 2 in the morning. And once again, we're getting these treatments that are designed to alleviate symptomology. Chamomile, of course, has a well-known anti-inflammation and soothing properties, helping soothing pain associated with various ailments. came across recipes for wine. Again, this would work, but it would be extremely rough. "10 gallons of wine, 30 pounds of raw sugar, boil it half an hour, scum it all the time, put in a tub, let it stand with new milk, put the warm quart of the butter, the fat to each gallon, let it stand for 24 hours, and the fat making a layer across the top to help protect against oxygenation." Likewise, we found in the Almanac quite a lot of recipes for animals. Here's one example for making oil for strains, bruises, sore breasts, scabs, burns, cuts, and so on, using niche foot's oil made from the shin bones of feet, but not the hooves of cows, using oil of chamomile, and mixing with turpentine. This is, again, one of those ones that have an effect not dissimilar to deep heat. Now, this is something I found interesting as well by Moses Stewart. And I found this significant because it, again, is referring to these people being part of a network. He's taken this recipe from Moses Stewart. Ben Noakes has taken it on board. William Allison's has copied it into his almanac to add to his own portfolio of recipes and treatments from this era. Pain in the head: aloes, chamomile, rhubarb, half an ounce of soap mixed in 20 pills. So what can we say about these sorts of remedies? We have a mix of folk remedies. We have a mix of ethnic and religious folklore. It is passed down predominantly orally between people in the community. A lot of it is tied to people's ethnic community, and the market for these tends to be tied to people from that ethnic community delivering the sorts of treatments and ailments and protections, charms and curses that they'd grown up with at home. I find this particular almanac a fascinating source because it's actually written down. It gives us some insight into what people were practicing. It gives us an interesting mix of magical beliefs, folkloric practices, things that are also found by trial and error that are integrated together and passed down through word of mouth. I found almost all of these people came from a convict background, and they came from very poor parts of rural UK. People moving into the cities, finding themselves unable to find work, being caught in petty crimes and then sent to Australia. And then in Australia, they continued practicing once they arrived. And one of the things I found particularly fascinating with this was a transition that happens around the 1870s, where it shifts from these kinds of folk remedies aimed at the working class communities in which people were living, and it starts to shift towards things we more traditionally associate with fortune telling today, such as tarot reading and astrology and so on, aimed at the middle class, which comes in with spiritualism around the 1870s and 80s, and the market changes. Starts looking at upper middle class people rather than working class communities. The type of remedies changes as well. I came across in one case of Mary Barrell talking about a protection from your home, taking an owl and cutting the owl in half and burying it at the front and rear end of your property. Likewise, things like shoes, placing them in the wall as a way of attracting the attention of evil spirits with shoes that would hold the shape of the person who owned them. Mary Barrell had a discussion of a witch bottle practice, which was a bottle filled with pins that the woman would urinate in, take down the Yarrawee River, hold in the water, and when the urine had left the bottle, in theory, the pain in childbirth would be resolved. So those sorts of practices start to disappear and become replaced with more traditionally middle-class, comfortable practices such as tarot reading. For many women, this served as an important vehicle for survival after the death of their husband. And for the cunning women that I've come across, invariably have found their husband has passed on, and then they've turned to fortune telling and selling remedies as a means of survival and earning an income. And you particularly see this with Mary Barrell and the conflicts that occur between more liberal-minded, more conservative-minded people in the Ballarat community regarding whether she should still be able to receive support from the benevolent asylum in terms of an income, despite engaged in what many people perceived as witchcraft. Another important angle for this as well is that for many people, it gave a sense of connection to home and family. You know, you've come from rural Cornwall, you've come to the gold rush, these things gave you a connection to home. One other example I've come across, for instance, is a pick that was found in an arena near Ballarat, which had been marked with pentacles and VV, Veneratus Virginium, into the side of the pick, presumably for good luck. But again, this relates to one of the complex issues here, where we can see the remains of these in old Goldfields buildings, but to what extent do people actually believe them? To what extent were they ritualistic? To what extent it was connected to home? It becomes tricky. Ben Noakes and his Almanac, and I've given you some examples here today, give us some idea of how these things are practiced, but it's complex. It's much like the question of if someone has a horseshoe on the wall of their property, they might feel uneasy if the horseshoe turns upside down or if it falls off. To what extent they believe it is a complex matter. And again, this is something that particularly being practiced by the poor, we don't really know for sure. But nonetheless, we have the residue in buildings, we have the residue in the papers, and we have these fragments, and we have fragments of occasional attempted lynchings and so on for witchcraft, such as poor Mary Burrell experienced, and particularly poor Mary Ann Wressell, who was assaulted for blood to wash Gottfried Hoffmann's hands. And with that, I would be very happy to answer any questions.